Oregon just made a couple of great additions in the portal for 2025.
You are Locked On Ducks, your daily podcast on the Oregon Ducks. Part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
Happy Monday. Yes, it is that time. Once again, for Locked On Ducks, I'm your host, Spencer McLaughlin. Thank you so much for making this your first listen or your first view of the day, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day and your number one source to stay up to date with the Ducks. This episode brought to you by friends over at FanDuel, where you can get a big return. New customers can place a $5 bet, and you'll get $150 in bonus bets if you win your first $5 bet. Visit FanDuel.com to get started. What do two transfer DBs for 2025 mean for a bunch of young guys on the roster? And Oregon has a transfer departure that, could be impactful. Maybe, possibly. I have thoughts on Emar'rion Winston leaving, all on today's show. But we start with the two newcomers, Dillon Thieneman, Theran Johnson. Get to know their names. They are going to be starting in Oregon secondary next year. This makes a whole heck of a lot of sense because Oregon is losing its top 6 defensive backs. Not corners, not safety, defensive backs across the board. Just the starters everywhere you look. Has Oregon recruited the position well? Yes. They just recruited this position incredibly well in 2025. They were always going to add starters. Now, the addition of Theran Johnson, who's a corner from Northwestern, Thieneman's the safety from Purdue. He was the highest rated safety in the transfer portal, according to 24/7 Sports. He's definitely the splashier of the two. I'll talk about him first. I wonder if they'll still go after other starters at this position group, either position group, I should say, safeties or corners. I don't know. That depends on how much confidence they have on the young guys that have been up and coming in the system in the last couple of years. But Thieneman is the guy that definitely generated the most buzz. Not that Theran Johnson isn't going to be a starter. I have a comparison for him that I think many of you will like. But Thieneman is the guy that I said last week should be Oregon's top transfer priority because safety has not been a position where Oregon has had a tremendous amount of productivity over the last few years. Now, yes, Evan Williams and Bennett Williams both racked up a lot of tackles. Evan was better than Bennett in coverage this year. Kobe Savage, Tyshim Johnson, they've absolutely had some really good moments. Consistent, high-level, back-end roaming safety play has been missing since Verone McKinley left the Ducks in 2021. It has not been there across the board. Thieneman's a guy that can provide that sort of stuff. So, talk about recruiting and developing. Purdue did a pretty good job with this guy because he was not some highly heralded recruit. Neither of these guys were originally, but they've both got a bunch of experience. These are the guys typically that Oregon brings in the portal. It's not usually Dante Moore type. Hey, we're going to bring you in. We're going to let you sit for a year, and then you're going to be ready the next season. Thieneman in the 2023 cycle was the number 988 player. He was ranked 988 according to 24/7 Sports. He was the Big Ten Freshman of the Year. He was a third-team All-American. He's 6 feet, 207 pounds. He has 2 years of eligibility left, and PFF actually has had him not having nearly as strong of a season as he did a year ago. I don't know how much you remember about the Purdue game, but Oregon pitched its first road shutout as a football program since 1991, I believe, was the year. 35-0 final score. Purdue did not beat a Power 4 team this year. They got beat by double digits against Oregon State. So, now that was before Oregon State had a bunch of injuries, but the Beavs didn't make a bowl game this season playing 7 Mountain West opponents. Purdue lost to them by, I think, 17. So Purdue across the board, not good. Not a good team. A year ago, Purdue wasn't good. They weren't as bad as they were this year. They, along with Florida State, were the worst teams in all of Power 4. A year ago, Thieneman had a PFF grade of 89.5. That's stupidly high, hence the All-American season. This year, it's down to 68. Now, 68, based on their metrics, is still a notch below what you consider to be a good player, but I love this move. There were a bunch of schools after him. Ohio State was after him. I believe LSU was in the mix. A lot of schools were reaching out to this guy. He was someone that Lanning had highlighted going into the Purdue game or coming out of it. There's a quote from Lanning about, 31 really flies around, makes plays, and goes sideline to sideline. That's what he can bring to the table. And that's been, I think, sorely missing. As great as Oregon's defenses have been the last 2 years, I wouldn't say any of the safeties Oregon has had are capable of playing like this guy. So plug and play starter, instant impact guy, right away, no questions asked. Thank you, check please. Second guy that Oregon brought in, who again is going to be a starter, Theran Johnson. He'll be a fifth year in 2025. It'll be his last year of eligibility. Back in the 2021 class, he was also not a super highly regarded kid. Number 732 player overall, according to 24/7 Sports. But over the last couple of years, per Pro Football Focus has really starting to take a step forward. Now, admittedly, I didn't have this guy on my radar. I talked about Takario Davis at Arizona. This would seem like a player who fits that mold. Doesn't mean they won't go after Davis, but I think, and I'll talk about this more later, there's at least one guy on there, and it could be Jahlil Florence perhaps, that they like as being able to step in and start at an outside corner position. Maybe not. Maybe they're not done adding transfer defensive backs for 2025. But his 76.7 coverage grade, which is solidly above average, is a career high. And a guy who has played a lot of snaps over the last several years. He's had a 70-plus overall grade over the last couple of years. He does just have the one season of eligibility left. He's 5'11", 182 pounds. Now, Gonzo was a bit longer, but this guy could be this year's version of Christian Gonzalez-Jabbar Muhammad, who, when they transferred to Oregon, came in 1 year off to NFL. Muhammad, of course, is going to be starting in the Rose Bowl, has all year. He's been exactly what I expected him to be. This guy feels like that. Veteran, could be an NFL player coming to Oregon to say, hey, I want to have an opportunity. I want the chance to play for the Ducks, to elevate and get on the NFL scouts' radar more than I otherwise would have. Not that Northwestern can't put guys in the NFL. They've got Rashawn Slater protecting our guy Justin Herbert, though that wasn't the problem for Herbert over the weekend. The Chargers' defense was quite horrible, uncharacteristically, but and then Bo Nix threw like 4 interceptions or 3, 4. I don't know. He was terrible. And then the Broncos won anyway, and the defense carried him. So it's nice to see Bo having a team around him up there. But that's kind of the comparison I look at with Theran Johnson. He had a pick 6 earlier this year against Iowa. It was a very physical play that he made, and he lined up in the slot, but he's primarily an outside corner. So size-wise, not quite as tall. He's closer to Jabbar Muhammad's height than he is Christian Gonzalez. But outside corner, 1 year of eligibility left, veteran, been proven capable as a Power 4 starter. This is a guy that makes a lot of sense for Oregon to bring in. So I'm a fan of both of these moves, and I'll tell you right now, broadly speaking, Oregon's not done with transfers. Not even close, by the way. There are a lot of other position groups where transfers will be brought in. But I had a couple messages from people saying, hey, why isn't Oregon landing any transfer? Why isn't it? A lot of factors go into a transfer portal recruitment. It can move quickly. They might add more transfers this week. We will see. There are certainly areas where adding a transfer would make sense. But defensive back, as I talked about on last week's show, makes a lot of sense. Even if you love the guys in the room, you can't rely entirely on a new defensive back room with guys who don't have some starting experience. So these guys are veterans. They are proven to be productive at the Power 4 level. They're proven to be good players at the Power 4 level, and they will absolutely be starting for Oregon secondary next season in a reload campaign, not a reset, reload. That's, I would think, how Dan Lanning approaches it. Let me know your thoughts in the YouTube comments, or hit me up on Twitter at @McLaughlinCFB or at LockedOnDucks. I got no less than 5 questions, which is a lot for a single topic, about what this means for young guys. Well, I have many thoughts, and Rashad Samples is sticking around. That's good news. That's all coming up next. First, let's talk about FanDuel. Get ready to tackle the NFL action with FanDuel, America's #1 sportsbook. Right now, new customers can bet $5 and get $150 in bonus bets if you win. The FanDuel Sportsbook app gives you everything you need to place live bets on the NFL all in one place. So when you get a hunch in the middle of the game, you can check out the latest stats, you can view live play-by-play, and so much more on the same page where you place your bets. Just visit FanDuel.com to join today. $150 in bonus bets if you win your first $5 bet. It can be anything. FanDuel.com, that's the place to go. College football playoff games start this week. Do you want in on the action? FanDuel.com, that's the place to go. Never waste a hunch. Make every moment more with FanDuel, an official sportsbook partner of the NFL. It's a good week to have a good week. It's the first time in a while for my everydayers out there that you've had to go 2 days in a row without a show. I hope you survived. I certainly did. But it's good to have the show back, as always. All right, so let's talk about the young guys, because you bring in Thieneman, you bring in Johnson, maybe just by lieu of his last name, he'll be the new Brandon Johnson, which I'd be down for. Brandon Johnson's been a stud this year for the Ducks. This question came from a Locked On Ducks insider, which you can become as well. Link in the description below. You can get a free 14-day trial. You get priority mailbag access and a bunch of other perks too. Question came in, and it's phrased like this. Didn't we just recruit a bunch of 5-stars? Are they not going to play immediately? Well, short answer, no. I don't expect them to play. They could. Somebody could. We've seen true freshmen play for Dan Lanning every single year in some capacity that he has been Oregon's head coach. The fun part, and what I'll talk about in the offseason on this particular program, not a program, this is a program, Lanning running a program. Important distinction there. So when you talk about high school recruiting, and other people ask me this question as well, why bring in transfers? Why do this? Well, remember once upon a time, there was a guy who was playing this Friday in a bowl game named Ty Thompson. And a lot of Oregon fans wanted him to get a shot. And instead, Oregon brought in Dillon Gabriel. Which move do you think was better for Oregon? All right, so that's plain and obvious. The same principle applies to every other position group. It is slightly different because there's just the one quarterback and you've got a bunch of DBs who, crack the 2 deep and end up playing important snaps throughout the course of a season, if not right away, but maybe they do right away and then it fades as the year goes on. There are a lot of guys in the secondary, linebacker, you just have a lot of players that get in there. So the way to think about it with high school recruiting is when you bring in, let's say, a trio of blue chip prospects at a given position, let's say defensive line, which Oregon recruited very well in the 23 and 24 cycles. When you bring in 3 defensive linemen at a given position group, the odds that all 3 of those defensive linemen turn into starters or heavy rotation guys is less than 5%. It happens. It absolutely happens. But here's a good example. Oregon in the 23 cycle brings in Mateo Uiagalelei, Tatum Tuioti, Blake Purchase. They all played as true freshmen. Purchase's role, I'm going to mention him more later in today's show, has diminished this year. Doesn't mean he isn't a good, capable player. Just means that other guys have proven themselves to be better. So you've got 2 out of 3. And by the way, Mateo's a starter. Tatum Tuioti, I'd say, is a heavy rotation guy. So all blue chip prospects, I think Tuioti was technically a 3-star, 4-star in some spots, but all guys who you looked at and said, boy, any one of these guys could play. Oh, these guys are playing, but only one of them becomes a starter. Every single program in America is going through the same exact process. Georgia, Bama, Texas, I don't care who it is. You bring in, and you should still care about and continue to celebrate recruiting victories that Oregon picks up. Because what the top programs are doing in this world of college football is saying, look, there is no way in a player evaluation in the NFL or college or high school or Pee-wee football, I don't care. You can't go 100%. Nobody does it. It's never happened before. So you'll recruit guys whose film looks good. Everybody's film looks good. It's about who can make that adjustment to the next level. And I used to talk about this a lot with regards to the 2023 group of defensive linemen. If you go back and listen to the shows I did talking about guys like Amari Washington, Terrence Green, Johnny Bowens, who has since transferred, Michael Gardner, all of those guys I looked at and said, any of them could figure out how to get into the starting rotation. Any of them could be high impact guys. They all have potential. They all look really good. And we have learned at this point, Amari Washington's the best of them. Doesn't mean the other guys will never develop a role. It just means that there is an element, no matter how good you are at player development, at recruiting, at identifying talent, anything like that. you have an element of, I'm throwing this spaghetti at the wall and I'm seeing what sticks. And the reason you want to bring in as many blue chip prospects as you can is there's a higher likelihood those guys are capable because of their physical traits, which is mostly what high school recruiting rankings are about. You have a higher likelihood that they're going to be able to turn into starters or higher level players. So when people ask me, well, what about the young guy? Why are they recruiting all these guys? Because yes, this guy over here, like Dalen Austin or Roderick Pleasant or Aaron Flowers, they're all tremendously talented. It does not mean their game will automatically translate to being a Power 4 starter in the Big Ten for a program like Oregon that expects to compete at a national championship level year in and year out at this point. You don't know that they're going to translate that right away. It might take them a little while. I get this question a lot with Jurion Dickey. Why isn't Jurion Dickey popping? Why isn't it come? Well, he's still got plenty of potential. He's battled injuries, so maybe he's not the same guy physically that he was coming out of high school. But for some guys, it just takes longer. It doesn't mean the potential you see on high school recruiting film isn't there or should be ignored or it's overblown or anything like that. It just means the number of guys that can make that jump quickly. So it is not very big. So when you look at this 2025 defensive back class, it's the best defensive back recruiting class that Oregon has ever had. Has ever had. And from a ranking standpoint, like, it's just not close. So they've got Naeem Offord as, you know, the big flip that they had on signing day. They kept Brandon Finney, who other schools were trying to flip. Those guys are really talented. You know how long it takes to get your body ready, to make sure that you can go toe to toe and not just be able to cover wide receivers. You got to be able to tackle running backs too. Most guys need a year, whether they're a defensive lineman or not, just to get their bodies in the sort of shape that allows them to be on the field and not get physically overwhelmed. Because if you put someone on the field before he's physically ready to do so, guess what? Guys on the other side, doesn't matter which team you're playing. I mean, maybe if you're playing Purdue this year, it matters less. But even then, you know, throughout the course of this year, we've seen Oregon's second team defense get into the game. That's full of a bunch of really talented recruits. Guys like Peyton Woodyard, or the since transferred Tyler Turner was out there. Aiden Breland would be a part of that group. Terrence Green as well. Elijah Rushing. What did you see in instances such as the Washington game or Michigan State when the second team defense went on the field? Those are talented guys. Freshmen, redshirt freshmen. The other offense could go up and down the field. So this is not to say that Oregon, I'm not of the belief that Oregon should just bring in a transfer at every single position, because that doesn't make a lot of sense. And you can't fill out a roster that way. You can't fill out a two deep that way successfully to compete at the sort of level that Oregon wants to every single year. You also cannot entirely rely on high school recruiting and say, well, we're just not going to add any transfers at all. Because you know what? Clemson is doing that, and they're having success. They just won the ACC. I've got news for you. They do not have one of the stronger rosters in the college football playoff. It doesn't mean they don't still have a great roster. They do. They recruit really well. They recruit at a top 10, 15 level. They've got a bunch of blue chip prospects. They retain talent for the most part really well, but their inability to use the portal makes it a drain on the program. So they lose a guy like Andrew Makuba, who Oregon was after. He's at Texas. That guy's a stud. And you then have to work with someone who's on your roster and is not as experienced, and would maybe even benefit more from sitting behind a veteran watching and learning, Dante Moore, rather than being thrust into a situation he isn't prepared for, because you don't have a higher end starter that can come in and give you a certain floor. Maybe not always the ceiling that the young guy can give you, but a certain floor of production where he's not going to make big mistakes, where he understands everything that goes in to being on the defensive side of the ball. So the true freshman playing right away, it's a difficult thing to do. Not impossible. Naeem Offord could play early. Brandon Finney could play early. I don't know. There are a lot of options, but that's what you want to have if you are Dan Lanning and Tosh Lupoy. You want to have options, and they have that. But you don't want to be entirely reliant on the portal. I think the best programs in college football that make the best rosters every year, they are going to have a blend every single year. You're not going to see young guys never get an opportunity. You're not going to see a reliance on those guys if they are not prepared. And you got to trust the staff's judgment, because I think they've kind of earned that at this point, right? That's the way I look at it. I think that's the way you should look at it as well. Full disclosure, that rant took a little bit longer than I was anticipating. But with regards to defensive backs, does Oregon have a starter on the roster already that we're just not thinking? I don't know. What do we make of cryptic tweets? Let's try and figure that out next. Well, folks, it's that time of year. The college football playoff is back, and with the newly expanded 12-team format, which I'm obviously a massive fan of, it's guaranteed to be bigger and better than ever, bringing you all the hard-hitting and high-flying excitement that you love. It all starts this weekend. TNT Sports coverage of the college football playoff begins December 21st, starting with the college football playoff kickoff show presented by AT&T at 11 a.m. Eastern, leading into our first matchup, SMU battling Penn State, who Oregon, of course, just defeated in the Big Ten championship game. That's at noon Eastern, all the way on the other side of the country, where Oregon will travel next season. You can see what that environment's like if you haven't seen it before. Then Clemson looks to upset Texas in a showdown at 4 p.m. Eastern in the 12-5 matchup. Don't miss a moment of the action. Watch the college football playoff presented by Allstate live on TNT, True TV, TBS, and Max. Cryptic tweets and Rashad Samples. Let me start with Samples briefly. So Oregon's running backs coach, who's hired when Carlos Lachlan went to Ohio State, guy's a dynamite recruiter. Dynamite recruit. Definitely, at least it appears from the outset, he played a role in getting Oregon to Corian Moore, who, speaking of true freshmen that can make an impact, that guy. Ooh, boy, that guy. Top of my list of true freshmen that are making an impact. The highest rated guy. Yes, amazing how that tends to work. But, Dorian Brew could come in and start a corner right away. That's a tough thing to do. Really tough thing to do. Receiver, a lot more transferable in today's world of football. But Rashad Samples was reportedly a candidate for the Sam Houston coaching vacancy. They have gone in a different direction, and Oregon is going to be able to keep the running backs coach for one more year. So, a question came in about the assistant pool that Dan Lanning has and whether or not it's good enough to keep these guys. First of all, in this instance, the answer is yes. Second of all, I never look at Oregon and what they're able to pay their assistant coaches and think, oh man, it's not enough. I did see a piece over by my guy, Zach Neal, looking at where Oregon assistants rank nationally in terms of how much they're paid at their position group. It's not always number one. It's not always top 10. It's not even always top 30 in the country, depending on which guy that you're talking about. But two thoughts. Number one, if there is a guy on staff that is really, really valuable and Oregon's got to have him, I think Lanning's going to be able to have the money. It's not an unlimited pool, unlimited NIL. Yeah, that doesn't exist. Nobody has a blank check across the board. Lanning can get enough. And if a guy does decide to leave, there will be more coaching departures. So far, that Rolodex that Lanning mentioned way back in his early days of being Oregon's head coach, so far that Rolodex is looking to be pretty fruitful with guys that know what they're doing. So Samples, Chris Hampton, those are guys that are non-coordinators. I do not expect to be on staff in 2026. Looks like they'll be there for 25. There's still a long ways to go. But when you've built a great program, that's what happens. Staffs turnover. That's just the way it goes. Everybody wants a piece of what you're doing over there. That's just a testament, and it comes back to the head guy. Do you trust Lanning? I do. So those are my brief thoughts there. On Jahlil Florence, though. So for those who don't know, Jahlil Florence had a cryptic tweet. He tweeted out, "Business is business." I don't know, man. What do you want me to take away from that? I read that and think, oh, he's hitting the portal. Well, as I'm recording the show, he hasn't done that yet. So, I don't know. He's been hurt this year. Thought he would have played by now coming into the season. He hasn't. Depth is important. And I don't know. One thing I do know is if he's healthy, he's a starting caliber corner. So if you're thinking about hey, how's Oregon going to replace this spot? Are they going to go to a transfer? Is Dalen Austin going to start? Is Roderick Pleasant going to be a guy? Well, we don't know the answers yet. That's what the offseason is going to be in order to figure out. But if Jahlil Florence comes back, I would imagine he's at least a heavy rotation guy, if not the starting outside corner opposite Theran Johnson, the Northwestern transfer I talked about earlier on today's show. That'd be my guess. But I am more than a little interested to see how that plays out, because that's a pretty significant player to have, maybe in, maybe out. He could be significant, could be not as significant. We have seen guys have their roles diminish over time, and sometimes they transfer out. And that's a perfect segue to Emar'rion Winston. So this is the highest impact transfer that Oregon has had so far. Dan Lanning's record, and I don't know how long it'll last, but hey, it is still going on so far. Not everybody can say that. Lanning often boasts, understandably so, about the fact that they've never had a starter transfer. Emar'rion Winston is as close to that as you can get. He is definitely not a starter. He does not play starter snaps. I wouldn't even describe him as a heavy rotation guy. This season, he's been, especially in the back half of the year, he's been a mild rotation guy. But still, he played just one snap in the Big Ten championship game. And a guy who I saw on the field who hasn't been playing very much this year compared to last season was Blake Purchase. He was on the field in a key pass rushing spot late in the game. I think it was one of the 3rd and longs for Penn State. 17, Blake Purchase went out on the field, and I thought, haven't seen him in a meaningful scenario in a while. It's mostly been as a part of the second unit. That second unit defensive line has been, when games are out of hand, like the Washington game, it's been Terrence Green, Aiden Breland, Mari Washington sometimes to get him more reps, Elijah Rushing, Ashton Porter, Blake Purchase. And then all of a sudden, Big Ten championship game. It's all on the line. There's Purchase again. I can't tell you what the thinking is there from Tosh Lupoy and Tony Tuioti, the defensive line coach. I can tell you that Winston's impact and presence was definitely felt more in the first half of the season than in the second half. In the second half, he's been anywhere from around 15 to 30 snaps a game %. That's a non-zero number. Someone's going to get it. Maybe they feel like it's Purchase. But I watched that Oregon defensive line get tired against Penn State, and Winston was someone, for whatever reason, they did not put on the field. But, his most impactful moment this year, 4th and goal pass breakup against Illinois long ago when, the game was still technically kind of in depth. But, Winston was out there a lot, sometimes playing a position physically doesn't look like he's supposed to be playing, where he'd line up on the interior of the defensive line. You go, wait a minute. He's almost a linebacker with that build. And he's lining up as a 3-tech on the interior. Okay. But then you look at his PFF numbers and go, hey, he's kind of solid. He's kind of solid. At the very least, he doesn't feel like he's a liability or a weakness out there. So certainly, as always, you wish him the best. I'm sure he can go somewhere and find a role that's bigger than what he had. I would guess, without having spoken to him or heard any quotes from his camp, that he's in the transfer portal because he can find a bigger role elsewhere. Not that he didn't like being at Oregon. Never heard anything to the contrary. But that he's a guy that if he can crack the rotation for this defensive line, he could certainly crack rotation at other Power 4 defensive lines in a more meaningful way. So he's transferred out, will not be playing on January 1st. I imagine that means we see a little bit more Blake Purchase, maybe a little more Jaden Moore as well. Got a lot of options in that rim. What was I talking about earlier? You want to have options. You want to have depth. Oregon's got a lot of options. But I definitely was a little surprised to see that he entered the portal, given that he's been, at the very least, start to finish this year, a mild rotation guy. And so he is no longer a Duck. So, once a Duck, always a Duck, of course. I didn't mean that as a mean thing or anything like that. But wrap up with a little basketball talk here, because Oregon's still ranked number 12 in the country. They controlled the game start to finish. Was nice to see him get off to a hot start against Stephen F. Austin, which is a middling team. They were once a really, really good program that went to the tournament all the time, and they've kind of been stuck in the mud in the last few years or so. Oregon was a big favorite. They won the game comfortably. They got up early. That was a nice thing to see because the slow starts have been troublesome. But over the last couple games, USC was a slow start, but UCLA really wasn't. It was just an unfortunate, dumb, banked in 3 at the end and the goaltend and all that stuff. But Oregon's still ranked 12th in the country. And by the way, every national champion since 2004, I believe it was, has been ranked 12th or higher in the AP poll at this point in the year. And Oregon's ranked 12th. So make of that whatever you will. College basketball is wild and crazy as always. But unfortunately, the biggest news coming out of this game was not that Oregon won, or that they, won by double digits and, had as big as a 23, 24-ish point lead at one point in time, and they still look back and said, feels like they could have played a little bit better. KJ Evans got hurt, so here we go again. An Oregon big for Dana Altman getting injured. Oh boy. He said after the game he doesn't expect it to be serious, but I mean, you knew it was showing up eventually, right? Like, this is just a tale as old as time. Oregon can't keep bigs healthy for an entire season. It's hard to keep big men healthy. That's been true in basketball for a very long time. There's something in that beautiful Oregon water that is just causing this to happen. It looked more serious initially than it ended up being, at least per Altman's comments. We don't know the severity. This is potentially a defensive loss. It's a depth loss because Evans has been coming off the bench, but he and Brandon Angel, I thought before the season they'd play together, but I hadn't seen Angel play enough, and Angel is definitely a 4. I thought he could be more of a 3, but he's not. He's a 4, so then you don't just stash Evans on the perimeter, and Dana made the adjustment pretty quickly. We said, yeah, okay, let's bring Evans off the bench with Supreme Cook, and it's worked really, really well. Now, the swap between Evans and Angel for Dana has been offense for defense. Angel's offense is crazy efficient. His footwork's good. He's great from 3. He's really good at the line. Evans' offense hasn't taken a step forward the way that I was hoping, particularly his 3-point shooting. However, as I have praised about him for a long time, he's a defensive stopper. He is a shot blocker. He can guard a number of different positions. He's a stud at that end of the floor. So, could Oregon survive for a while without him? Yeah. Sure, if he ends up missing a couple games, I'd still expect the Ducks to win their next 2 going into conference play, which begins with the new calendar year. But I'll have an update when Oregon puts it out about how severe the injury actually is. You're hoping that, as Dane Altman said, it's mild, that it's not a big one, because this is a guy who I like having. Because sometimes you need a defensive the energy he can bring off the bench. The scoring potential is there if he can continue to round out his offensive game. But one of the reasons Oregon has had a great start is they have been deep, they have been long, they've been playing defense all year, and KJ Evans has been a big part of that defensively off the bench. What Keyshawn Bartholomew is offensively off the bench, Evans is defensively. I know when they come into the game, they're going to give you exactly what their job is. So, hopefully he's not out for a while, and hopefully the injuries don't snowball. Appreciate everyone listening. I'll see you next time. Have a wonderful rest of your day, and go Ducks.